In 2020, 2/3 of New Zealanders voted yes to legalising euthanasia in New Zealand under the condition of certain safeguards. Now, however, under ACT MP Todd Stephenson, a new amendment bill has been introduced which seeks to liberalise access to euthanasia throughout the country and expand the scope of this bill. I want to know if this promotes choice or actually puts vulnerable Kiwis at risk. Today I sit down with Maryanne Spurdle, who's the Research Manager at Maxim Institute, to talk through these proposed changes and let us know what's really going on. Hi, Maryanne.
Hi, Vicky.
Thanks for joining us today. Now, I know that earlier this year you authored a paper interrogating choice, in which you sought to actually figure out the real-world implications of the End of Life Choice Act in New Zealand. And you've been following this debate pretty closely. I'd love to know what this new bill is actually proposing.
Yeah, what it does is his previous version of this bill was going to remove the 6-month prognosis. So at the moment, a doctor has to say you probably have 6 months or less to live. That's one of the criteria. This would remove that. And in addition, this revised bill takes the 25 recommendations that the Ministry of Health made in its report last November, which I address in Interrogating Choice, and it would suck them all into the End of Life Choice Act. It's done this in the name of kind of like tightening things up, as in it's been running for a little while, we're just going to tweak things and make it work better based on feedback. However, the key elements of the amendment bill would actually do away with some safeguards, and it would expand access. The specific things that I think would make the biggest change are obviously removing the 6-month prognosis. Now we're talking about people who are not terminal. It would allow doctors to offer euthanasia to patients who may be eligible. In other words, they can say, we can line you up for chemotherapy, and have you considered euthanasia?
Yeah.
At the moment, that is not allowed. So that's actually quite a significant change that we can talk about. It narrows what conscientious objection looks like for doctors. It would also mandate all care facilities to allow it on site.
Wow.
So no euthanasia-free zones anywhere. And it would allow patients to waive the requirement to consent on the day of death, which means you could schedule euthanasia if you are eligible, and then on the day, if you are worried about losing capacity, you don't have to okay it, which raises all sorts of ethical questions, because if you're losing capacity and someone comes along to give you a lethal injection and you're suffering from dementia or a brain tumor, are you going to want on that day what you thought you would want 4, 5, 6 months prior or not?
So essentially they can't change their mind.
You can, like they can object, but if you're suffering from something that's limiting your, mental
How do you actually measure that?
And there are examples from overseas that show that actually this is not in line with autonomy and free choice. Actually, all of these things are pushing beyond what voters a few years ago considered choice.
Yeah.
These things are actually limiting choices in many ways. Those are the key elements of this amendment bill that I think are concerning.
Rather than tightening things up, it sounds like they're actually liberalising.
Hugely.
Yeah. And initially, our law stated that only the terminally ill would qualify, and you just mentioned the assisted suicide wasn't offered to people who weren't dying. So under this bill, how wide will it be stretched for those who are wanting to receive euthanasia?
On paper, people can make assumptions. We can look to Canada to find out what it actually looks like in real life, because you've got criteria, even now the criteria, 6-month prognosis, unbearable suffering. All of those things are very open to interpretation. And we've got examples of that here. In Canada, what they did, they legalized euthanasia almost 10 years ago. And then in 2021, they created 2 tracks. And it's called Medical Assistance in Dying, MAID. So they've got a nice, friendly sounding acronym there. Track 1 is the traditional foreseeable death, which even there, some doctors interpret to be 8 to 10 years as foreseeable. So the open for interpretation is like wide open with these things. Track 2, death does not have to be foreseeable. That opens it up to people with degenerative conditions, with disabilities. So you've got people there who are being approved because they've got anorexia, hearing loss, illnesses that are treatable, dementia. And And the literature is interesting because you've got different doctors who are approving people with the same condition, some under track 1, some under track 2, which just highlights the whole grayness of the situation. The issue with stretching it that wide is a lot of people who are suffering from a lot of different things are now eligible to end their life with the help of government services. There are plenty of people suffering from those illnesses and conditions and disabilities who actually want support living, and they're now suddenly eligible to end their lives. So it's a huge shift from last resort, what people here voted for, what people in Canada expected, last resort, people who are suffering unbearably, to actually anybody who's finding life difficult and has a condition that could eventually lead to their death. An important comparison with Canada is that for track 2 made in Canada, they're required to have a 90-day assessment period with the understanding that if somebody's death is not imminent, they should really consider other options. And for all of Canada's issues, they at least give people 3 months to do that, where you can't go, again, anorexia, things that are treatable, and then say, here, the fastest time from application to death has been 2 days.
This has happened 2 days.
Yeah. It took an OIA to get that information from our friends at Ethos. But yes, the most common time frame from application to death here is 2 weeks. There's not a whole lot of time to stop and consider. Canada's required 90 days for track 2. We have no wait time. And this legislation is proposing opening it up to non-terminal patients with no wait time. And we know you can access it within 2 days. So this is actually liberalizing it hugely. If you look to liberal countries, Belgium is one of them. They require referral to palliative care first. So they're liberal on many fronts, but they go, you should at least explore these options. Here's your referral. New Zealand has none of that. Oregon, one of the earlier adopters of euthanasia, liberal in some ways, but they don't permit doctors to administer lethal drugs. Voluntary euthanasia. They only permit assisted suicide where you can get a prescription for it, and that it has its own problems. However, only 0.5% of deaths in Oregon are from euthanasia. In Canada, where both is legal, it's 5% of all deaths. Wow. In growing. We're 1.3% of all deaths in growing. So this would put us on track to be the most liberal of the liberal jurisdictions that allow euthanasia.
This feels worrying for those who are in very vulnerable situations. And like you mentioned, with access being expanded, you have someone coming in who is suffering with anorexia or maybe a mental health diagnosis, and in the current moment are going, this is too hard, I don't want to deal with this anymore. But what if they change their mind? Mm-hmm. Could you talk more to us about how this would affect the most vulnerable in New Zealand?
Now at the moment, mental health issues aren't on the table. We can look to Canada again and read our future. So in Canada, it's been approved. It's been delayed because of understandable issues. 2027, they're going to open it up to people with mental health issues. So at the moment, it has to be a physical issue. The plan is in just over a year, people with mental health conditions will be eligible. Here, that's not the case. This legislation is limiting it to conditions that are physical. However, that still leaves a whole lot of vulnerable people who would be eligible. And for a kind of, I don't know if objective is the right word, but for kind of a global perspective on what this means for vulnerable people, you've got the UN's Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, who have publicly stated that Canada needs to repeal Track 2 MAID. They are absolutely opposed to it. It says they fundamentally changed the premise of assisted death on the basis of, in their words, negative ableist perceptions of the quality and value of the lives of the disabled.
Wow.
So you can see where this argument is going. There was an excellent article in The Atlantic. It's titled, "Canada is Killing Itself." And one of the lines in there is that death never presents itself neutrally. So we've got to keep that in mind when we talk about whether or not this should be a subject that's raised with patients.
Todd Stephenson's bill references Canada. So obviously as a country, we're looking to Canada as to where we go and what we do next. Could you tell us what's happening in Canada right now?
Yeah. And we keep talking about Canada because what we're doing would make us far more similar to Canada than anywhere else in the world that's legalized euthanasia. And I mentioned that Atlantic article. Here's a quote from it. Has Canada itself gotten what it wanted? 9 years after the legalization of assisted death, Canada's leaders seem to regard MAID from a strange, almost anthropological remove, as if the future of euthanasia is no more within their control than the laws of physics, as if continued expansion is not a reality the government is choosing so much as conceding. This is the story of an ideology in motion, of what happens when a nation enshrines a right before reckoning with the totality of its logic. If autonomy in death is sacrosanct, is there anyone who shouldn't be helped to die? So this is from The Atlantic, a pretty neutral observer. And we've got other things like the UN's objections that I mentioned, 5% of all deaths, so it's becoming quite ubiquitous. We talked about expanding the eligibility to people with mental illness, which completely flips the way we normally approach mental health care. You want hope in mental health care. Talking about euthanasia is the opposite of that. And then you've got official reports and leaks that show that there have been more than 1,000 potential breaches of regulations. And this is something that we need to keep an eye on here because we keep hearing we've got tight safeguards. Well, when there are breaches, what happens? There, after more than 1,000, you've got no law enforcement action. Doesn't mean nobody's died unlawfully. It means there's zero incentive to report things to law enforcement, and the handful that do, what's law enforcement going to do? You've got somebody who's dead that you can't interview. You might have a complaint from the family. Well, families are sometimes unhappy. And you've got a doctor who, well, they signed off on it according to the legislation, so they have ticked the box. And if they miss a box, which has happened here, or the information is incorrect, that's not prosecutable. That's just, whoops, maybe a little disciplinary, remember how to do this procedure next time. This is from Dr. Alan Weeb, who was interviewed by The Atlantic and is also in Liz Carr's documentary, and she offers euthanasia. She's notorious for approving people who other doctors have said, no, you're not eligible, and if you go to her, you will be eligible. She's had complaints made against her, and in response to a question around that, she says, well, if a lawyer says, I disagreed with some of those things, I'd say, well, they didn't put lawyers in charge of this. She laughed. We were the ones trusted with the safeguards. And then the Atlantic says, and the law was clear, Weeb said. If the assessor, meaning herself, believes that they qualify, then I'm not guilty of a crime. This is how the safeguards work. This is what Canada's finding. So we really have to stop and ask, do we want to open it up when this is the way that people's eligibility and deaths are assessed?
Removing protection for the most vulnerable and shifting the fabric of society.
Yeah. You've got people who are disability advocates who are strongly against euthanasia in general, but particularly when it's opened up to people who are not near death. It sends a clear message that your life may not be worth living. So that's kind of the reason why you've got a broad cross-section of society going, this is actually quite damaging. Liz Carr is a disability rights activist in the UK. She's done a documentary with the BBC with the title Better Off Dead. And that highlights a lot of the real world situations people find themselves in. The fact that doctors can offer it to patients, that also makes somebody more vulnerable. The argument for the legislation is that people have a right to know what their options are. But that's ludicrous because this isn't like, shall we perform surgery or go straight to chemotherapy? It's not that kind of option. This is an option that takes all the other options off the table. So that argument is a bit spurious. The matter that isn't considered is if you allow doctors to offer it to patients, then you get all sorts of doctors offering it to the same patient at different stages. And that's actually very mentally and emotionally taxing. And there's plenty of stories from overseas. But if you can picture, you get a breast cancer diagnosis, and at the time you receive the diagnosis, the doctor offers it to you, and then your GP brings it up with you, and the oncologist brings it up with you, your surgeon brings it up with you. And this is not hypothetical. One of the stories that's been publicized from Canada is a woman who not once but twice was offered it as she was preparing for a mastectomy. She obviously objected to it because that was not what she wanted to be talking about. Like, if you're finding the prospect of the surgery too daunting, here's this other option. That is not what we want.
And it makes me concerned for those patients who, unlike her, maybe don't feel strong enough within themselves to say, this isn't what I want to be talking about. If you're in a highly vulnerable situation, possibly your family is already considering you a burden, and now the doctors are suggesting
your
it.
Family is, anybody who's dealing with something like this is already vulnerable. You've got military personnel in Canada being treated for PTSD. They're being offered MAID. They're sitting on long wait lists for things like wheelchairs and disability ramps and treatment for things. They can access MAID very, very quickly.
And MAID, just to clarify again, is
assistance in
euthanasia.
Dying, yeah. You've got, so there was one ALS patient in Canada who wrote her own obituary, and it's really tragic. But she makes very clear the situation for her. Ultimately, it was not a genetic disease that took me out. It was a system. I could have had more time if I had more help. Opening it up to vulnerable people means that people who are struggling to get the help they need will take it as an option because they're missing other types of support. And you're putting them in an impossible situation. And the societal attitude for some people shifts to, well, at least they have that option. And I think it's very clear to hold the line and say that's not compassion. Taking all other options off the table, ending the sufferer, is not compassionate. There are other issues that need to be dealt with. And as far as raising it with patients, I found this really educational. I watched a webinar that a panel of doctors in Canada who provide MAID, so they're not against it. They were talking about the topic of Track 2 MAID, doing a lot of complaining about the critics and kind of dismissing the concerns people have. This is what one of them said about the issue of being able to raise it with patients. And she was actually defending the ability to continue doing this. She said, I can well believe that a patient whose doctor informs them of the existence of MAID as a treatment option, either in general or in their specific circumstances, could be interpreting that as encouraging them to pursue it, when that may not be the case at all. They're often very emotionally charged situations where you're providing end-of-life care or care to someone in difficult circumstances. So what they hear and how they hear it may be very different from what you intend. We don't have a lot of control over that. We can try to be careful in how we express anything related to MAID and perhaps couch some of the information in qualifying terms like saying, I'm not suggesting that you do this or recommending to you, but I want you to know this is something that exists as one of your treatment options. But still, we can't control how somebody hears that. To me, that says, since you can't control how someone hears that, you shouldn't bring it up, which is why our legislation is written the way it is. She is saying this in the sense that, well, it's not our fault if they take it the wrong way.
This is really significant. And I'd love to actually touch in a moment where we're at in New Zealand in terms of how much choice is already being presented, and do we need to expand the scope of this access? But you touched on this briefly. What does this mean for doctors and other medical professionals in the sense of those who, unlike the doctor you were mentioning, who actually don't conscientiously feel right about performing or even talking about assisted suicide as an option? What is the new bill going to mean for them?
Yeah, so there are conscientious objection rights. This narrows them. It interprets them a certain way where doctors have to give effective referral. So they have to provide notes and they have to provide information to patients who request it. And that's nudging the line a little bit. The more serious concern I have, I mentioned this at the start, is that all care facilities would be mandated to allow it on site. The Ministry of Health's recommendations put accreditation on the line. That's not named in this legislation, but there is a hospice in Canada that refused to offer it on site, and the state took it over. So the charity lost their right to run their own hospice that they'd raised funds for. So that's potentially what could happen to places that go, we want to be a euthanasia-free zone. For medical professionals, if every site is mandated to allow it, then they will not be able to work in a place where it's not happening. And for people with conscientious objection, that is actually, that creates moral injury. Being complicit in the patients that you're treating, the rooms you're going in and out of every day are the site of this happening. And that obviously impacts patients as well. If you can't go to a rest home in the country where your neighbors don't have the option of being killed in their rooms, that limits your choices. There's only one hospice in New Zealand that does allow euthanasia on site presently. And I know that when it made that decision, a number of staff left. The official word from this hospice is that they lost 2 staff because of it. And I think they're just rewriting the reasons why a whole bunch of others left. They actually had a decent exodus. Those people would have nowhere else to work with different conditions. I know that there are patients who've opted not to be admitted to that hospice for the reason that they don't want to live in a place where that's happening. They would lose that choice. So ironically, this change would actually limit choice for practitioners. It would limit choice for patients. And it doesn't need to. You can keep euthanasia legal without mandating it in every area. The argument that this would limit access for people, again, it's just an excuse to make it normal everywhere at all times.
So currently access is not limited. You actually can access it, but this would mean it's in every single place. So actually doctors and those who don't want to access lose their choice.
Yeah, the rationale is it would be too hard to transport someone elsewhere. And that might be tough for some people, but what's the trade-off? The trade-off is this draconian no euthanasia-free space anywhere for anyone.
Before we wrap up, Maryanne, I just wanted to ask quickly, I guess to clarify what New Zealand is doing. You mentioned earlier that in Canada, for example, there was this difference between those who actually wanted appropriate care and weren't able to be offered it, but then could access euthanasia so rapidly. What are we doing in New Zealand around palliative care?
Yeah, and this was an important theme in what I wrote earlier in the year. Palliative care is underfunded. There isn't an emphasis on training up both new people to be have expert practice in palliative care, and also upskilling other practitioners in their palliative care practice. It needs to be prioritized. There have been studies that show that it's not, and intentions are put out there that it will be, and nothing's actually happening. Hospices provide on-site palliative care, and they also provide training and support in their communities. People can get palliative care in their own homes. We have a colleague whose father underwent that recently, and they were able to keep him at home the whole time and provide get support for the family provided by the local hospice. So it does extremely good work, the whole hospice network, but it gets barely half of its funding from government, a little less than, and relies on fundraising. So those are the things that really need to be shored up. It takes money and it takes intentionality, but actually hospices, for instance, every dollar that they're funded, you get $1.59 worth of services. So the only thing more economical than not fully funding hospices is to just deny some people access. It's this decision that we're making. And now we've got fully funded, accessible anywhere in the country euthanasia. If we don't have at least as good coverage with good end-of-life care, then what we're doing is we're actively giving people the choice between ending their own lives and suffering unnecessarily because the system is not going to support their area.
Is there research to show that if you were to offer someone palliative care or really good alternatives, is there any research that backs up they then might change their mind and say, actually, I no longer want to opt for euthanasia because now I've been given the care I need? Is that out there?
There are plenty of signs that there are people choosing euthanasia because they lack care. In Canada, it's really stark. They've got, if you look at the stats of those who are approved for track 2 MAID and track 1, so one terminally ill, one mostly terminally ill, the other not. So if you split up those applying into segments of most least vulnerable in different areas, which one report has done, those who are applying for track 2, if you compare them to those applying for track 1.
And track 2, just to clarify, is more
non-terminal.
Non-terminal mental health conditions.
Not mental health conditions
not mental
yet,
health, but
but it's supposed to be coming online.
Anorexia, things like that.
Things that physically could kill you eventually.
Right.
You're declining and suffering, and the suffering can be mental.
But it's not imminent.
No. Track 2, far more likely to be vulnerable in areas like work, housing, areas living in areas of the country that are poorer. So there's a clear gap between track 2 and track 1 that shows people who are not terminally ill are way more likely to apply for track 2 if they have poor housing, if they're unemployed, if they've got all these other confounding factors. And that just shows that the reason is not pain at the end of life, suffering that isn't being exacerbated by other issues that can be addressed. So yes, it increases the chances of somebody deciding to end their life.
Well, that leads me to my final question for you, which is what can we do and what should be done, therefore, to help with the situation? I know someone might be listening right now and they're going, what do I do about this?
Yeah. And it seems like a done deal because it's legalized now. You know, a lot of people move on. They fight the battle and they're like, oh, well, it's just, we lost, it's legal. The reality is that there are changes in the legislation that are being proposed and changes that could be made. If this bill gets pulled, then other people can suggest changes to the legislation as well that might actually tighten up the safeguards. So that debate hasn't finished. If the bill gets pulled, there will be a very brisk conversation about what all of these details and other ones that maybe should be included in it. And just so people are aware, last time there was a referendum on a bill that had been, it was passed by Parliament. This time it will be purely MPs who decide, and it will be a conscience vote. So every single MP will have the opportunity, if this gets pulled, to vote for and against it. And there will be a group of MPs who get to decide if there should be changes, additions, deletions in what's being proposed here by Todd Stephenson. Those who want it to go through are fully aware that all 25 recommendations and the removal of the 6-month prognosis are unlikely to all pass. So figuring out what this should be and letting our MPs know where the concerns are. And they're huge concerns. I think sharing stories from Canada, it's very sobering. There are people in Canada who were fine with euthanasia being legalized who now want them to back up the truck. Many, many physicians who are in that boat. So I think pointing people to what's actually going on and saying, do you want this here? Very, very few people do. What people think is legal, even now what people think is legal and what's actually legal, there's a huge gap. And studies in Canada have shown that people in Canada do not actually want the details of their current legislation. The door has been pushed open by other people. If they had the choice, they would wind it right back.
Wow. Thank you for sharing, Maryanne. I really appreciate your time with us and for giving us a helpful, even suggestion as to what we could do next in talking to our local MPs. To stay updated as this debate unfolds, make sure you head to maxim.org.nz and sign up and subscribe to this podcast.